Across the cotton plantations of South Carolina's Low Country, a strange warning circulated in hushed tones among slave traders, a warning that made no economic sense at all: never buy the man with one blue eye. By 1847, at least 17 plantation owners had purchased him, and every single one sold him within days. Some took losses so severe they would have ruined lesser men. The pattern became so terrifyingly consistent that Charleston's markets eventually refused to auction him altogether. So what could one man possibly do in just 7 days that would make the most ruthless slaveholders, men who built fortunes on cruelty, willingly choose financial ruin rather than keep him another week? The truth is scattered across ledgers, hidden letters, and testimonies that surviving witnesses spent decades trying to erase. Before we continue with the story of the slave who broke the will of South Carolina's wealthiest men, make sure you're subscribed to Vintage Chains and hit that notification bell. What you're about to hear has been buried for more than 170 years. And drop a comment below telling us which country you're watching from. We love seeing our community from all over the world. The first record of this man appears not in a sale document but in a ship's manifest. The Providence Dawn made port in Charleston on March 3, 1847, carrying 340 souls from the windward coast. Among them was a man the ship's surgeon noted simply as male, approximately 30 years, unusual eye coloration, heterochromia, one brown, one blue. The surgeon, a doctor, Nathaniel Grantham, added a peculiar observation in his private journal. The African exhibits no fear. This troubles me more than if he had wept. Charleston's slave market operated with ruthless efficiency. The city's economy ran on the sale of human beings, and buyers knew exactly what they wanted. Strong banks for rice fields, Recapio creative daily YouTube recaps in your inbox per top listening for hours. Start reading in minutes. Every morning at 8 a.m., our AI-powered digest lands in your inbox with all key insights from your favorite YouTube channels. Start your daily recap spur. Answered skilled hands for carpentry, domestics who understood their place. The auction house on Chalmers Street smelled of sweat, fear, and the salt air rolling in from the harbor. Buyers moved through the holding pens with a detachment of men inspecting livestock. The man, with one blue eye, he gave no name, and none was recorded, stood apart from the others in an intangible way. He was neither the tallest nor the most physically imposing, but seasoned traders found their eyes drawn to him, then quickly looking away. When the auctioneer asked him to demonstrate his strength, he complied without hesitation or civility. When examined for scars or signs of rebellion, he stood perfectly still, his mismatched eyes fixed on some distant point no one else could see. Samuel Pritchard, owner of Marsh Haven Plantation, paid $1,100 for him, a premium price reflecting both the man's apparent health and the current demand for field labor. Pritchard was known as a calculating businessman who turned 800 acres of mosquito-infested swampland into one of the region's most profitable rice operations. He wasn't given to sentiment or superstition. His overseer, a man named Clayton Hobbs, noted in the Plantation Journal that the new acquisition was assigned to the 3rd Field Gang and given the designation Isaac, a name Pritchard assigned arbitrarily, as he did to all his property burr. Marsh Haven operated like most low-country plantations. The rice fields stretched toward the horizon, geometric patterns of channels and levees that turned marshland into gold. 200 enslaved people worked those fields under a system refined over generations, a hierarchy of drivers, overseers, and owners that maintained control through calculated brutality and the constant threat of separation. The quarters consisted of rough cabins arranged in neat rows, each housing multiple families in spaces barely large enough for sleeping. Isaac was placed in a cabin with 7 others. That first night, according to later testimony from a woman named Rebecca, who survived into the 1890s, he said nothing. He accepted the cornmeal and salt pork ration without comment. When the others spoke, he listened with an attention that made them uncomfortable. The blue eye, Rebecca would later say, seemed to see through things. Not magic, she insisted to her interviewer. It was like he was reading words written on your soul that you didn't know were there. The routine at Marsh Haven started before dawn. The horn sounded at 4, and by 4:30 workers were in the fields. Rice cultivation was back-breaking labor. Standing in water up to the knees, backs bent, hands blistered and bleeding from the sharp-edged rice stalks, the overseers moved on horseback and the crack of the whip provided punctuation to the workday. Pritchard prided himself on running an orderly plantation where discipline was maintained without excess. Isaac worked with mechanical precision. He learned the rhythm of rice cutting in hours, matched the pace of men who'd done it their entire lives by the second day. The overseers found nothing to fault. He was neither rebellious nor obsequious. He simply worked, ate, slept, and worked again. But by the fourth day, something had changed at Marsh Haven, though no one could identify exactly what. The first indication that something was wrong came from Clayton Hobbs himself. On the morning of Isaac's sixth day at the plantation, Hobbs arrived at the main house 2 hours before his usual time. Pritchard's house servant, a man named Daniel, later testified that the overseer looked as though he hadn't slept. His hands trembled as he asked to speak with the master immediately. What passed between them remained private, but witnesses in the house reported raised voices. Hobbs left within the hour. He never returned to Marsh Haven. His wife collected his belongings 3 days later and told anyone who asked that her husband had taken a position in Georgia. The plantation records show he forfeited 2 months' salary rather than work out his notice. Pritchard himself went to the fields that day, an unusual occurrence that sent ripples of unease through the quarters. He was seen speaking briefly with Isaac, though no one could hear what was said. When Pritchard returned to the main house, his wife commented in a letter to her sister that he had taken ill with some disturbance of the nerves and had retired to his study with a bottle of whiskey. The next morning, the 7th day since Isaac's arrival, Samuel Pritchard did something unprecedented in his 20-year career as a plantation owner. He took Isaac directly to Charleston and sold him at the first market that would accept the transaction for $800, a $300 loss. When the buyer, a man named Joseph Merriweather, asked if there was any defect in the slave, Pritchard's response was noted in the sale document. "No physical defect. I simply have no further use for him." Merriweather owned a turpentine operation in the Pine Barrens north of Georgetown. He was a practical man who saw a bargain and took it. According to his own later account recorded in a deposition for an unrelated legal matter, he noticed nothing unusual about Isaac during the journey to his property. The man was quiet, compliant, and showed no signs of disease or injury. The turpentine camps operated differently from rice plantations. Men worked in small groups, tapping pines, collecting resin, managing the distillation process. It was dangerous work. The stills exploded regularly, and the forests held their own hazards, but it required some independence and judgment. Merriweather placed Isaac with an experienced crew and thought nothing more of it. For 3 days, everything proceeded normally. Isaac learned quickly, worked steadily, and created no disturbances. On the 4th day, Merriweather found himself unable to sleep. He later described it as an inexplicable anxiety, a feeling that something in his camp had gone fundamentally wrong, though he could identify nothing specific. On the 5th day, 2 of his other workers requested transfer to a different crew away from Isaac. When Merriweather demanded an explanation, they couldn't provide one. "Something ain't right about him," was all they would say. On the morning of the 6th day, Merriweather made his own decision. He took Isaac to Charleston and sold him to a rice factor named Benjamin Ruddled for $750. Merriweather refused to discuss his reasons. Even when Ruddled pressed him, the sale document notes only seller expressed urgency. Transaction completed same day. By late April 1847, a pattern had emerged that defied everything Charleston's slave traders understood about their business. Isaac had been sold 6 times in as many weeks. Each transaction resulted in a financial loss for the seller. Each new owner reported the same progression: initial confidence, growing unease, and finally an overwhelming compulsion to be rid of him regardless of cost. The story spread through Charleston's commercial district in the way that truly inexplicable things do, quietly at first, then with increasing urgency. Men who'd spent decades in the slave trade began comparing notes. The accounts were remarkably consistent. Isaac performed his assigned labor without fault. He committed no acts of violence, made no threats, attempted no escape. He was, by all objective measures, an ideal slave, yet within a week, sometimes less, his owners became desperate to sell him. Several took significant financial losses. One man, a plantation owner named Thomas Cunningham, reportedly sold Isaac for $500, half the typical market value after only 5 days. When a colleague asked why, Cunningham's response entered the ledger of bizarre statements that surrounded this case. "I would have given him away for free. I would have paid someone to take him just to have him gone." The Charleston Mercury carried no formal articles about the situation. Such matters were considered private commercial affairs, but coffeehouse conversations buzzed with speculation. Some suggested Isaac carried disease, though medical examinations found him healthy. Others proposed he was somehow poisoning his owners' minds with African witchcraft, though this theory was dismissed by the city's more educated residents as superstitious nonsense. Dr. Marcus Fairchild, a physician with interest in the emerging field of mental medicine, took note of the case in his private correspondence. In a letter to a colleague in Philadelphia dated May 2, 1847, he wrote, "I am intrigued by accounts of a Negro slave who appears to induce psychological distress in those who claim ownership of him. Multiple men of sound reputation and business acumen have behaved in economically irrational ways after brief exposure. The question presents itself. What mechanism could produce such consistent effects across varied individuals? The slave traders themselves began to refuse him. The auction houses on Chalmers Street and Queen Street developed an informal policy. They would not accept Isaac for sale. Private dealers who operated in the markets on Vanderhorst Wharf turned him away. By mid-May, Isaac had become essentially unmarketable in Charleston proper. This should have been the end of it. An unsellable slave would typically be sent to the agricultural interior, sold at steep discount to small farmers, or put to work in the most brutal industrial operations, where turnover was high and questions were few. But Isaac's case had attracted enough attention that even those usual outlets began to close. Josiah Toomeen was not a man given to curiosity about slaves. As one of Charleston's most successful cotton factors, his business involved moving agricultural products from plantation to market, managing the financial arrangements that kept South Carolina's economy running. He dealt with enslaved people, as one might deal with any other form of property, as assets to be accounted for in ledgers, their value calculated in dollars and cents. But Toomeen was also a meticulous record keeper with an analytical mind, and the Isaac situation offended his sense of order. In early June, he began collecting testimony from the men who'd owned the slave, attempting to identify some logical explanation for the pattern. His notes, preserved in the Toomeen family papers now held at the South Carolina Historical Society, reveal a man increasingly frustrated by the inadequacy of the information. Samuel Pritchard would only say that he'd lost confidence in the purchase. Joseph Merriweather claimed incompatibility with camp operations. Benjamin Ruttold offered nothing beyond business reasons. The other owners were similarly evasive. Toomeen's investigation took a different approach. Rather than interviewing the owners, who clearly would not or could not articulate their reasons, he sought out the enslaved people who'd worked alongside Isaac. This was unusual. White Southerners rarely consulted slaves for information beyond immediate practical matters. But Toomeen's curiosity had become genuine obsession. What he learned disturbed him enough that he stopped his investigation entirely and destroyed most of his notes. The surviving fragments suggest that Isaac possessed an uncanny ability to understand the psychological foundations of the slavery system itself, the fears, guilts, justifications, and moral compromises that allowed men to build their lives on human bondage. Rebecca, the woman who'd shared quarters with Isaac at Marsh Haven, told Toomeen, "He never said nothing about rebellion, never spoke against the masters. But when he looked at you with that blue eye, you suddenly saw yourself as you really were, not what you told yourself you were." And for them, white men, what they really were must have been a terrible thing to see. Another account from a man named Jacob, who'd worked with Isaac in the Turpentine camps, described something similar. Isaac could listen to a man talk for 5 minutes and know everything about him, know his fears, know his secrets, know what he hid, even from himself. And somehow, without saying a word, he'd make you know he knew. That was what scared them. Not what he might do, what he already knew. The most detailed account came from a house servant named Phyllis, who'd worked in Benjamin Ruttold's household during Isaac's time there. She described an incident on Isaac's 4th day when Ruttold had summoned him to the study. Phyllis, serving tea, witnessed the conversation. Ruttold had asked Isaac directly, "What do you do to unsettle men?" According to Phyllis's testimony, Isaac had responded with perfect courtesy, "I do nothing, sir. I work as instructed. I obey all commands. If my presence causes discomfort, perhaps you should consider why that might be so." The phrasing was respectful, the tone deferential, but Ruttold had gone pale. He dismissed Isaac immediately and spent the next 2 days in visible agitation before selling him at a significant loss. By June, Isaac had been sold 11 times. His market value had dropped to $400. The financial losses to his various owners now totaled over $2,000, a substantial sum representing the price of the man's own freedom several times over, squandered by men who found his mere presence intolerable. A Charleston merchant named William Thorne, who specialized in difficult sales, finally found a buyer in the agricultural interior. A plantation owner named Davies Fletcher, who ran a remote cotton operation near the Savannah River, purchased Isaac for $350. Fletcher had a reputation as a particularly harsh master who believed that proper discipline could break any slave spirit. When told about Isaac's history, Fletcher laughed. "I've dealt with rebellious Negroes before. This one will be no different." Davies Fletcher's plantation, called Riverside, though it's at a good mile from the Savannah, operated on principles that made even other slaveholders uncomfortable. Fletcher believed that enslaved people responded only to overwhelming force, that any hint of independence needed to be crushed immediately and publicly. His plantation had the highest rate of injuries in the district, and visiting neighboring planters often commented on the fearful atmosphere among his workers. Isaac arrived at Riverside in late June. Fletcher made a point of establishing dominance immediately, a practice he followed with all new acquisitions. He had Isaac stripped and examined in front of the assembled enslaved population, a humiliation designed to establish helplessness. When this failed to produce the expected fear, Fletcher had him assigned to the most brutal work details, clearing new ground in weather hot enough to kill men dawn to dusk with minimal water. Isaac endured it without complaint or apparent distress. A week passed, then two, Fletcher's overseer, a man named Sullivan, began making the same observations that had troubled Clayton Hobbs at Marsh Haven. Isaac worked steadily, neither fast nor slow, never shirking, but never exceeding what was required. He ate whatever food was provided. He slept when allowed. He showed no emotion. And yet, Sullivan reported, the other enslaved people began treating Isaac differently, not with fear or hostility, but with a kind of quiet deference that had nothing to do with formal hierarchy. In the quarters at night, people spoke more freely when Isaac was present. The usual caution that governed all interactions seemed to evaporate around him. More troubling to Sullivan was his own behavior. He found himself hesitating before issuing punishments when Isaac was nearby. The casual brutality that was his stock in trade suddenly felt performative, hollow. He began avoiding direct contact with Isaac, assigning him to work details where supervision would fall to others. Fletcher noticed his overseer's unease by the third week and confronted him directly. Sullivan, according to his own later account, couldn't explain it. The Negro does nothing wrong. But when he looks at me, I feel judged. Not by him, by myself, as if I'm seeing my own actions through eyes that haven't learned to justify them yet. This conversation enraged Fletcher. He prided himself on his unshakable convictions, his certainty that the system he maintained was not only economically necessary, but morally correct. The suggestion that one African slave could undermine that certainty struck him as both absurd and personally insulting. He decided to break Isaac through direct confrontation. On the morning of Isaac's 25th day at Riverside, Fletcher had him brought to the yard behind the main house. The entire enslaved population was assembled to watch. Fletcher announced that Isaac would be whipped, not for any specific offense, but as a demonstration that no slave at Riverside was beyond his power to humble. What happened next entered plantation legend and was documented in multiple accounts. Isaac stood at the whipping post without resistance as his wrists were tied. Fletcher himself took the whip, an unusual choice, as owners typically delegated such tasks to overseers. He delivered the first strike across Isaac's back with practiced force. Isaac made no sound. The second strike fell, then the third. Fletcher continued with increasing violence, the whip cutting through skin, drawing blood. The assembled people watched in horrified silence. 10 strokes, 15, 20, Isaac never made a sound. He didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, his mismatched eyes, one brown, one blue, fixed on the horizon. At 25 strokes, Fletcher stopped, not because Isaac had broken, because Fletcher himself could no longer continue. Multiple witnesses reported that the plantation owner was weeping, his face contorted with an emotion that none of them had seen before or could name. Fletcher dropped the whip and walked into his house. He emerged 3 hours later, ordered Isaac's wounds treated, and announced that the slave would be sold immediately. But something had changed. The calculated brutality that Fletcher had wielded so easily for decades now seemed to pain him. In the week that followed, before he could arrange Isaac's sale, Fletcher was observed wandering his property at night, apparently unable to sleep. His wife wrote to her sister that Davies had become melancholy and speaks of matters I do not understand. On the 7th day after the whipping, Fletcher took his own life in his study with a pistol. His suicide note, sealed by his family and never officially released, reportedly contained a single sentence: "I have seen what I am." Fletcher's death sent shockwaves through South Carolina's planter class. Suicide was rare among slaveholders. These were men who'd built empires and fortunes, who considered themselves the foundation of Southern civilization. That one of their number would take his own life, apparently in connection with a single slave, was almost unthinkable. The official story, spread quickly through sympathetic newspapers and social networks, was that Fletcher had suffered from undisclosed financial difficulties and melancholy. The timing of Isaac's presence at Riverside was coincidental. Respectable people did not believe that a slave could drive a master to suicide through psychological means, but the rumors persisted, and now they carried genuine fear. Isaac passed into the ownership of Fletcher's estate administrator, who held him for exactly 3 days before selling him to a trader heading toward the Alabama frontier. That trader kept him for 2 days before passing him to a colleague in Georgia. A week later, Isaac was in Tennessee, then Kentucky. Each transaction involved a loss. Each new owner reported the same pattern: initial confidence, growing unease, desperate urgency to be rid of him. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Isaac's story intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. By September 1847, Isaac had been sold 23 times. He'd traveled through 6 states. His market value had dropped to $200. But something else was happening, something that would prove more dangerous than anything that had come before. Enslaved people were talking, not openly, not in ways that white Southerners could easily detect, but through the communication networks that existed beneath the surface of plantation society. Songs, coded messages, stories passed from field to field, plantation to plantation. The story of the man with one blue eye, who could make masters question their own certainty in a system built on absolute power and psychological domination. This was revolutionary, not because Isaac advocated for violence or escape, he apparently never did, but because his very existence demonstrated that the master's certainty could be shaken, that the elaborate justifications they'd constructed for slavery could be made to feel hollow and false even to themselves. A minister named Reverend Aldrich Hayes, who served several plantation parishes in Mississippi, noted in his diary that summer, "There is a disturbing current running through the Negro population. Not rebellion in the traditional sense, but a kind of quiet confidence that troubles me greatly. They speak in riddles about judgment, seeing truly. I fear some new form of resistance is taking shape." What Hayes couldn't have known was that the resistance wasn't in what Isaac did or said, it was simply in what he was, a living demonstration that enslaved people could see their masters with perfect clarity, understanding them better than they understood themselves, and that this knowledge, this seeing, was itself a form of power that no amount of physical force could suppress. In October, Isaac was purchased by a man named Nathaniel Grantham, the same ship surgeon who'd first examined him in Charleston. Grantham, who'd since left maritime medicine to open a practice in New Orleans, had followed Isaac's story with scientific fascination. He saw an opportunity to study what he believed was a unique psychological phenomenon. Grantham's approach was different from previous owners. Rather than trying to dominate or control Isaac, he simply observed him. He provided adequate food and housing, assigned light labor, and attempted to engage him in conversation. Grantham kept detailed notes on every interaction, trying to identify the mechanism by which Isaac produced his effects on others. For 2 weeks, nothing remarkable occurred. Grantham began to suspect that the entire phenomenon was mass hysteria, that previous owners had worked themselves into irrational states based on rumor and superstition. Then on the 15th day, during what Grantham later described as a routine conversation, Isaac spoke more than he had to any previous owner. The conversation was recorded in Grantham's journal, which survived in his family's papers. Grantham had asked, "Do you understand what you do to people?" Isaac's response, "I do nothing to people, doctor. I simply allow them to see themselves without the stories they tell to make their actions bearable. Most people can live with anything if they tell themselves the right story about it. When that story fails, they must either change their actions or live with the truth of what they are. Many men find the second option unbearable, Grantham pressed. But how do you accomplish this? What technique do you employ? I employ no technique. I simply exist. The question you should ask is not what I do, but why your society has created a situation so morally untenable that the mere presence of someone who sees clearly becomes unbearable. The conversation continued, ranging across philosophy, morality, and the psychological mechanisms of oppression. Grantham's notes reveal a man increasingly disturbed by the implications of what he was hearing. Isaac spoke with an educated vocabulary and sophisticated reasoning that contradicted every assumption about African intellectual capacity that Grantham held. By the conversation's end, Grantham was questioning not just slavery, but the entire worldview on which his society was built. He sold Isaac the next day. By November 1847, Isaac had become more legend than man. His story had spread beyond the plantations south, into northern newspapers where abolitionists seized on it as evidence of slavery's moral corruption. The Charleston Mercury finally addressed the situation, dismissing it as exaggerated accounts of a Negro of no particular significance inflated by those with political motives. But in the South among slaveholders, a different conversation was taking place. In private letters, in whispered discussions at social gatherings, in the careful language men used when discussing things that frightened them, a question circulated. What if Isaac represented something more dangerous than rebellion? What if he represented the emergence of a form of resistance that couldn't be suppressed by force? A South Carolina legislator named Edmund Casters wrote to his brother in Virginia, "The Isaac situation troubles me more than any slave revolt I have studied. The Denmark 5Y conspiracy could be crushed. Nat Turner's rebellion could be put down with militia and rope. But how does one defend against a Negro who simply makes men see the truth of their own actions? If one such slave can shake the confidence of dozens of owners, destroy the certainty of men I have known as pillars of our community, what happens if others develop similar capabilities? What happens if this spreads?" The question hung over the planter class like smoke from a distant fire. In Charleston's private clubs, men who'd spent decades defending slavery with elaborate philosophical and biblical arguments found themselves unable to articulate what made Isaac different. He'd broken no laws, he'd committed no violence, he'd made no incendiary speeches. Yet his mere presence had proven corrosive to the psychological certainty on which the entire system depended. Dr. Nathaniel Grantham, still deeply shaken by his conversation with Isaac weeks earlier, attempted to present his findings to the Charleston Medical Society in early November. His paper, titled Observations on Psychological Distress Induced by Moral Contradiction, was rejected before he could deliver it. The Society's president, Dr. Augustus Hammond, wrote in his rejection letter, "The implications of your research are dangerous. You suggest that our social system requires psychological delusion to function. Such conclusions, whether true or false, cannot be given public forum." Grantham's private response, preserved in his correspondence, was telling. "My dear Hammond, I did not suggest this. I observed it. There is a difference." Isaac revealed nothing new. He simply made visible what was always there, that we have built our prosperity on a foundation we cannot bear to examine directly. The answer to what Isaac represented came from an unexpected source, the enslaved community itself. A woman named Hannah, who'd worked for 30 years in various Charleston households, finally agreed to speak with Josiah Tremaine as he quietly resumed his investigation. Hannah was unusual in several respects. She could read and write, taught secretly by a sympathetic owner's daughter decades earlier. She'd been manumitted 5 years prior due to her owner's death and a generous will, making her one of Charleston's small population of free people of color. Her testimony, recorded in Tremaine's reform notes, provided crucial context that white observers had entirely missed. "You're asking the wrong questions," Hannah told Tremaine during their meeting in the back room of a colored church on street. "You want to know what Isaac does, what technique he employs, as if he's performing some kind of conjuring trick. But Isaac isn't magic. Isaac is just smarter than you. Smarter than any master I've known. He learned your language perfectly. Not just the words, but the meanings beneath the words. The things white folks say without saying them. He learned to read and write before he was ever captured in Africa. He had an education that would shame most white men in this city." Tremaine pressed for specifics. As for Hannah's account, detailed over several meetings, painted a picture of Isaac that contradicted everything white Southerners believed about African intellectual capacity. Isaac came from a merchant family in what you call the Windward Coast, Hannah explained. His father traded with British ships. Isaac learned English from English traders, learned to read from Christian missionaries. He studied mathematics, navigation, philosophy. When he was captured, betrayed by a rival family, and sold despite his status, he already understood more about your world than most white men understand about their own. On the ship, he stayed quiet, watched, listened, learned more. By the time he reached Charleston, he understood not just your language, but your fears, your justifications, your lies. This information came from conversations Hannah had conducted with enslaved people who'd worked alongside Isaac. The underground communication networks among Charleston's enslaved population had tracked his movements, collected stories, shared information. While white owners saw only their own discomfort and couldn't articulate its source, the enslaved community recognized exactly what was happening. Isaac understands something that terrifies white folks, Hannah continued. He understands that the entire system of slavery only works if you can convince yourselves that we are less than human, that we don't feel like you feel, think like you think, love like you love. You need to believe that we're suited for slavery, that it's natural, that God ordained it. The moment you truly see us as people, as intelligent, feeling, fully human people, the whole thing becomes unbearable. Isaac doesn't do anything except exist as proof of our full humanity. He doesn't need to speak against slavery or plan rebellion. His intelligence, his composure, his clear understanding of what you've built, that alone is enough to shatter the comfortable lies. And for men who've built their lives on those lies, his existence is worse than any rebellion. Tmain's notes suggest this explanation disturbed him profoundly. He'd spent his professional life treating enslaved people as economic units, calculating their value in ledgers, managing their sale and transport as he would any commodity. The possibility that many of them possessed intellectual capabilities equal or superior to his own, that they saw through every justification he'd ever made for the system, was almost unbearable to contemplate. But Hannah wasn't finished. "There's something else you need to understand," she said. "Isaac knows that the white men who own slaves are trapped too. Not like we're trapped, don't mistake me, but trapped in their own way. They've built their whole lives, their wealth, their standing in society on slavery. They've told themselves stories about why it's right and necessary. They've twisted their religion to justify it, twisted their philosophy, twisted their understanding of human nature. And now they're in too deep to get out without losing everything. Their fortunes, their social position, their sense of themselves as good men." Isaac sees that trap. He sees how they've imprisoned themselves in their own lives. And when he looks at them, they see themselves reflected in his eyes, not as the benevolent patriarchs they pretend to be, but as men who've chosen comfort and profit over their own humanity. This psychological insight that Isaac threatened not just the slaveholders' external power, but their internal self-conception explained what nothing else could. The men who'd owned Isaac hadn't simply found him inconvenient or troublesome. They'd found him unbearable because he made them unbearable to themselves. Hannah's testimony paradoxically made Isaac even more dangerous to the slaveholding class. If his effect came from intelligence and education rather than some inexplicable phenomenon, it meant that other enslaved people could potentially develop similar capabilities. The carefully maintained fiction of intellectual inferiority, crucial to justifying the system, was threatened not by Isaac alone, but by what he represented, the possibility that hundreds of thousands of enslaved people might see their oppressors with the same clear-eyed understanding, might recognize the moral and psychological weakness beneath the displays of power. The implications were discussed in coded language among South Carolina's political elite. A series of meetings took place in Charleston that November, attended by prominent planters, merchants, and politicians. No official minutes were kept, but correspondence from several attendees survived. The consensus was clear. Isaac needed to be removed from circulation entirely, and measures needed to be taken to ensure no similar case could develop. In the week following these meetings, South Carolina's legislature began drafting new laws. One proposal would make it a crime to teach any enslaved person to read or write, with harsh penalties for both teacher and student. Another would require the registration of all enslaved people with unusual skills or education. A third would mandate regular inspections of slave quarters to identify and remove any materials that might facilitate learning. These laws were presented as responses to general concerns about slave literacy and potential rebellion, not specifically about Isaac, But those who'd attended the November meetings understood their true purpose: to prevent the emergence of other enslaved people who might possess Isaac's dangerous clarity of vision. In December, a consortium of slave traders pulled resources to purchase Isaac with a specific purpose. They paid $150 for him, the lowest price yet, with no intention of resale. The consortium included some of Charleston's wealthiest men operating through intermediaries to hide their involvement. Their plan was simple but brutal: transport Isaac to Texas, to the most remote cotton plantation available, where his influence couldn't spread and where the conditions would presumably break even his remarkable composure. A plantation called Bitter Creek, located in the piney woods of East Texas near the Louisiana border, was selected. The owner, a man named Silas Garrett, ran one of the harshest operations in the region. Mortality rates among his enslaved workers were double the regional average. Garrett's philosophy was that slaves were cheapest to replace than to maintain, so he worked them to death and purchased replacements. It was, the consortium members agreed, the perfect place to bury Isaac, where he could do no more damage. They underestimated him one final time. Isaac was transported to New Orleans in late November, held in a commercial slave pen while arrangements were finalized for the journey to Texas. The pen's operator, a man named Maurice Dufresne, kept detailed records of all his temporary charges. His notes on Isaac were brief but revealing. Negro male, educated, dangerous, keep separate from other stock, minimal interaction. During his 2 weeks in New Orleans, Isaac was held in isolation, a small cell with a barred window overlooking the pen's courtyard, but isolation couldn't prevent him from observing. From his window, he watched the daily operations of the slave trade, the inspections, the sales, the separations of families, the casual brutality that defined the business. He also watched the men who worked in the trade, and what he saw would prove significant. Among Dufresne's employees was a man named Thomas Webb, a former overseer who'd taken work in New Orleans after leaving plantation life under unclear circumstances. Webb was assigned to guard Isaac during his confinement, bringing meals and ensuring he had no contact with other enslaved people. Webb later testified in a deposition taken for an unrelated legal matter years later that he'd spoken with Isaac several times during those 2 weeks. The conversations, Webb said, had changed his life. "I thought I'd seen everything," Webb stated in his deposition. "I'd worked plantations for 15 years. I'd done things I'm not proud of. But I told myself I was just doing my job, following orders, maintaining discipline." Isaac didn't accuse me of anything, didn't condemn me. He just asked questions, simple questions that I couldn't answer, like, if you saw a white child treated the way you treat enslaved children, what would you feel? Hi, when you go home at night, do you tell your wife exactly what you did that day, or do you leave parts out? Just questions. But every question exposed something I'd hidden from myself. Webb continued. On his last night in the pen before they loaded him on the boat for Shreveport, Isaac told me something I've never forgotten. He said, "Mr. Webb, you have a choice that enslaved people don't have. You can walk away from this. You can decide tomorrow that you will no longer participate in cruelty. That choice is what makes you more responsible, not less, for what happens here." The next morning, I didn't show up for work. I left New Orleans that week. I couldn't do it anymore, couldn't be part of it. Webb wasn't the only person in New Orleans affected by Isaac's presence. Dufresne himself, despite his policy of minimal interaction, found his certainty shaken. His business records show that he sold his slave pen 3 months after Isaac's departure and moved to New York, where he invested in shipping and never returned to the slave trade. On December 10th, Isaac was loaded onto a steamboat called the Tempest's Grace, bound for Shreveport and then overland to Bitter Creek Plantation. He was placed in chains for the first time in his entire period of captivity, a tacit admission that normal methods of control had failed. The chains were heavy iron connected to a post in the hold where cargo slaves were kept during river transport. The Tempest's Grace was captained by Terrence Walsh, a 40-year-old riverboat man who'd spent 2 decades on the Mississippi. Walsh ran a tight ship known for punctuality and professionalism. He transported cargo of all kinds, including enslaved people, with the same efficient detachment he brought to cotton bales or machinery. The journey upriver would take 3 weeks, fighting against the current, stopping at various landings to load and unload cargo. Isaac was one of 7 enslaved people being transported by various owners to destinations along the river. The others were kept in a separate section of the hold, but on the second night, Walsh made a decision that would later seem significant. He moved Isaac to a small storage room near his own cabin, officially because the iron post in the main hold was needed for securing other cargo. What happened during those 3 weeks on the river was documented only partially through Walsh's personal log and later testimonies from crew members. But the fragments that survive paint a remarkable picture. Walsh, unlike previous owners, seemed curious about Isaac rather than threatened by him. During the evening hours, when his duties allowed, he would visit the storage room where Isaac was kept. The conversations that occurred are largely unknown, but Walsh's log contains several cryptic entries. December 12th, spoke with the cargo Negro about river navigation. His questions were surprisingly sophisticated. December 15th, discussed current political tensions with the educated African. His analysis of Southern fears regarding federal power was more insightful than most speeches I've heard in Congress. December 18th, cannot sleep. The Negro asked me a question I cannot answer. If I know that the cargo I'm transporting is human, not property, why do I transport it? I replied that I am simply doing business, breaking no laws. He said nothing in response, but his silence was more eloquent than any argument could have been. Walsh's log from December 19th contains a longer entry. I have spent 20 years on this river. I have transported everything imaginable: cotton, sugar, machinery, livestock, and humans. I have never questioned the rightness of any of it. The law permits it, the market demands it, society accepts it. But tonight, looking into the eyes of this chained man who speaks with more education and insight than most free men I know, I am forced to ask, what am I? Not what do I do, but what am I? If I am a man who transports other men in chains, knowing them to be men, what does that make me? The next entry, dated December 20th, was the last Walsh would write for several weeks. It contained only one sentence: I have made a decision that will cost me my livelihood and reputation, but I find I can live with that more easily than I can live with what I have been. Somewhere on the Mississippi on the night of December 20th, 1847, Isaac's chains were removed. What exactly happened that night became the subject of intense speculation and conflicting accounts. The official report filed by Walsh when the Tempest's Grace reached Shreveport on December 28th stated that Isaac had somehow slipped his chains and jumped overboard during the night watch. The river was searched for 3 days. No body was recovered. The consortium members who'd purchased Isaac and paid for his transport were furious, but there was little they could do beyond absorb the financial loss. But crew members on the Tempest's Grace told a different story in the years that followed. Their accounts varied in details but agreed on the essential facts. Captain Walsh had personally removed Isaac's chains, provided him with food and some money, and allowed him to leave the boat during a stop at a small landing in Arkansas. Some accounts suggested Walsh had arranged for Isaac to meet with free people of color who operated part of what would later be known as the Underground Railroad. Other accounts were less specific, saying only that Isaac had walked away into the darkness, and Walsh had made no effort to stop him or raise an alarm. Walsh himself never publicly confirmed what happened. When questioned by the Tempest Scrax owners about the incident, he stuck to his official story. The slave had escaped, method unknown, but Walsh's actions after reaching Shreveport were telling. He completed his contract to deliver the remaining cargo, then resigned his position. He returned to Pennsylvania, where he'd been born, and never worked the river again. The story of Isaac, if that was even his real name, officially ended with his disappearance from the steamboat on December 20th, 1847. The Charleston Mercury ran a brief notice about a drowned slave in early January, misidentifying him as James and getting several details wrong. The slave traders who'd lost him never publicized the full story. It was easier to absorb the financial loss than to explain how 28 different owners over 8 months had all found one man so psychologically unbearable that they'd collectively lost thousands of dollars trying to be rid of him. But the impact of his brief passage through the American South rippled outward in ways that no one fully documented or understood at the time. Plantation records from the late 1840s show unusual patterns among the men who'd owned Isaac, even briefly. Samuel Pritchard, the first owner, began showing signs of what his family described as nervous melancholy in the spring of 1848. He sold Marsh Haven Plantation in 1849 at a significant loss, accepting an offer well below market value, and moved to Philadelphia, where he invested in textile manufacturing. His wife's letters to her sister document the change. Samuel will not discuss his reasons for leaving Carolina. He says only that he can no longer live in a manner that conflicts with his conscience. He has become nearly obsessed with reading anti-slavery literature, though he will not speak publicly on the subject. Pritchard never fully explained his transformation, but in a private letter to his brother written in 1851, he came closest. I have seen what we are, not what we tell ourselves we are, not what we present to the world, but what we actually are, when stripped of all our justifications and philosophical dress. A man showed me this, though he spoke hardly a word. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. I could not continue. Benjamin Ruddle's evolution was more gradual but equally significant. He dramatically reduced his slave holdings between 1848 and 1850, selling or manumitting more than two-thirds of the people he'd claimed as property. He began writing letters to newspapers advocating for gradual compensated emancipation, a position that made him a pariah among Charleston's planter class, but gained him some respect in northern circles. His family's papers show that he faced social ostracism and business difficulties as a result, but he persisted. In a diary entry from 1849, Ruddle wrote, "I cannot pinpoint the precise moment when my certainty crumbled. Perhaps it was gradual, years of small doubts accumulating until the weight became unbearable. Or perhaps it was one specific moment, looking into the eyes of a slave I briefly owned, and seeing reflected there not hatred or fear, but a kind of profound sadness, as if he pied me, as if he understood that I was trapped in something terrible of my own making. Since that day I have been unable to maintain the comfortable illusions that once sustained me." Joseph Merriweather, the turpentine operator who'd owned Isaac for less than a week, sold his entire operation in 1848 and moved west to California during the gold rush. He left no written record of his reasons, but his sister's correspondence mentions that Joseph had become deeply troubled in spirit and needed a complete change of scenery and occupation. Even men who'd never personally owned Isaac but had been involved in his sale or transport showed signs of psychological impact. Several slave traders in Charleston left the business between 1848 and 1850, transitioning to other forms of commerce. Some moved north, others remained in the South, but refused to continue participating in the slave trade specifically. Dr. Nathaniel Grantham's transformation was the most dramatic and publicly visible. He abandoned his medical practice in New Orleans in early 1848 and moved to Boston, where he became involved in abolitionist circles. He wrote extensively about the psychological damage that slavery inflicted on both enslaved and enslaver, publishing a series of essays in The Liberator and other anti-slavery publications. His most influential work, published in 1850, was titled The Moral Cost of Human Bondage: Observations on the Psychological Mechanisms of Oppression. While the essay never mentioned Isaac by name, its themes clearly grew from Grantham's 15-day observation of him. "I have witnessed firsthand how the institution of slavery requires from its practitioners a profound self-deception. To own another human being as property, one must convince oneself that the owned person is somehow less than fully human. But this conviction is always fragile, always threatened by reality. The enslaved person's intelligence, emotions, moral reasoning, these are constantly visible to any observer who chooses to see. Therefore, the slaveholder must engage in continuous psychological work to maintain the necessary delusion. Any person or circumstance that interferes with this work becomes unbearable, not because they threaten the slaveholder's physical safety, but because they threaten the psychological structures that allow him to live with himself." Grantham's writings influenced a generation of abolitionists and contributed to the growing body of anti-slavery literature in the 1850s. He never publicly discussed his personal encounter with Isaac, but those who knew him understood that his transformation had stemmed from a specific experience that had shattered his certainties. Terence Walsh, the riverboat captain, followed a similar path. After returning to Pennsylvania in early 1848, he became involved with local anti-slavery societies. He was particularly active in helping escaped slaves reach Canada using his detailed knowledge of river routes and southern geography. In 1852, he published a memoir titled 20 Years on the Mississippi, a riverboat captain's confession, which included a chapter on transporting enslaved people. The chapter never mentioned Isaac specifically, but contained this passage: "There came a moment in my career when I could no longer maintain the separation between the cargo and the humanity. I had always known on some level that the people I transported in chains were people, but I had told myself that I was simply a businessman operating within legal bounds serving market demands. Then I met someone who made that comfortable story impossible to maintain in a series of conversations that I cannot fully recount, partly because they are too personal, partly because words failed to capture what was communicated. I was forced to see myself clearly. I was not a neutral businessman. I was an active participant in cruelty. And once I saw that, I could not continue. Among enslaved people throughout the South, the story took on different forms and meanings. In some versions that circulated through the underground communication networks, Isaac was a scholar prince from an African kingdom who'd been captured by mistake. In others, he was a gifted teacher who'd learned the white man's knowledge and used it against them. Some stories claimed he'd made it to freedom in the North, was living in Canada, or had even returned to Africa on a friendly ship. The most common version passed through songs and coded conversations emphasized not Isaac's origins but his ability. He could make masters see themselves truly. This theme struck a deep chord because it hinted at something far more dangerous to the slaveholding South than rebellion or escape, the idea that enslaved people held a power no chain could suppress. The power of seeing clearly, the power of understanding their oppressors better than the oppressors understood themselves. A song that began circulating in the late 1840s, recorded decades later by folklorists, carried verses that captured this truth. One eye brown and one eye blue, sees what the master can't see through. Bent his back but kept his mind, sight stayed sharp, not made blind. Master sells him, can't say why. Just can't stand that one blue eye. Sees the truth without the lie. Makes the master want to cry. To white listeners, it was just another field song. To those who knew the story of Isaac, it was a coded anthem, a reminder that resistance didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refused to bow. Hannah, the free woman of color who helped Josiah Twain understand Isaac's significance, became a guardian of his legacy. As the 1850s unfolded and national tensions grew, she became openly involved in abolition networks, helping enslaved people escape. She was arrested in 1858 and jailed for 3 months. After her release, she wrote to an abolitionist friend, "Masters fear rebellion, fire, blood, destruction. But what they should fear more is the day enslaved people stop pretending, the day they stop performing the lie." Isaac never raised a hand. He simply refused to act the part they wrote for him. And that refusal, multiplied across thousands, could bring down everything they built. Josiah Twain underwent his own transformation. He never declared himself an abolitionist publicly. His wealth and status made that impossible. But his letters reveal a man quietly breaking from the system. In 1854, he sold his cotton factoring business and moved into banking, refusing to profit from slavery. It cost him money and standing, yet he held firm. In an 1860 letter to his son, he wrote, "I discovered that our system requires blindness, deliberate blindness. Anyone who interferes with that blindness becomes unbearable to the rest of us. I can no longer pretend not to see what is plainly visible." Meanwhile, South Carolina lawmakers, terrified by what Isaac had exposed, passed laws in 1848 and 1849 criminalizing the education of enslaved people. Books, writing, literacy became threats far greater than weapons. Isaac had proven that intelligence itself could destabilize the entire system. Throughout the 1850s, more white Southerners began to feel the cracks forming. Some experienced sudden crises of conscience. Others slowly lost faith in the world they'd inherited. The louder the defenses of slavery became, the more obvious the insecurity behind them. Everyone sensed the foundations weakening. By 1861, when the Civil War finally erupted, no one connected the conflict to a single enslaved man with mismatched eyes. Historians trace the war to politics, economics, ideology, but never to one African man who had spent 8 months proving that slavery was a psychological system built on lies, and that those lies shattered when confronted with truth. Maybe that's how history works. Huge events shaped by countless unseen acts, ripples that spread until they're indistinguishable from the waves. No one knows for certain what happened to Isaac after December 20th, 1847. Perhaps he drowned in the Mississippi, another lost victim of a system that couldn't tolerate him. Or perhaps he escaped through the Underground Railroad network near the Arkansas landing and made it north. A tantalizing clue surfaced in 1852 when Frederick Douglass wrote about Meeting, a remarkable man from the South, educated in Africa, whose insights into the psychology of slaveholders surpassed anything I have heard. He provided no name. It might have been Isaac or someone like him. The evidence is thin, but the possibility lingers. What isn't in doubt is the impact Isaac left behind: 28 documented owners in 8 months, 5 men who abandoned the slave trade entirely, others who suffered breakdowns, crises of conscience, or total transformations. Dozens more whose lives bent in ways they couldn't explain. And beyond those records, countless enslaved people who learned from him, who saw in him a reminder that the mind could stay free even when the body was chained. Isaac didn't start a rebellion. He didn't lead an uprising. He didn't write pamphlets or give speeches. He simply existed as a fully conscious, fully intelligent human being inside a system that required him to be less than human. And that alone cracked the world for everyone who encountered him. This story reminds us that the most powerful form of resistance isn't always violent. Sometimes it's the refusal to pretend, the refusal to let oppression rewrite your mind, the refusal to play the part demanded of you. What do you think? Did Isaac possess some unique gift, or was his power simply the truth everyone else tried to avoid? Can one person change the world just by refusing to hide who they are? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you and you want more hidden histories and buried mysteries from America's past, make sure you subscribe to Vintage Chains. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And share this video with someone who loves stories that challenge what we think we know. See you in the next chapter of the past, one that refuses to stay forgotten. This theme struck a deep chord because it hinted at something far more dangerous to the slaveholding South than rebellion or escape, the idea that enslaved people held a power no chain could suppress, the power of seeing clearly, the power of understanding their oppressors better than the oppressors understood themselves, a song that began circulating in the late 1840s. Recorded decades later by folklorists, carried verses that captured this truth. One eye brown and one eye blue, sees what the master can't see through. Bent his back but kept his mind, sight stayed sharp, not made blind. Master sells him, can't say why, just can't stand that one blue eye. Sees the truth without the lie, makes the master want to cry. To white listeners, it was just another field song. To those who knew the story of Isaac, it was a coded anthem, a reminder that resistance didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refused to bow. Hannah, the free woman of color who helped Josiah Twain understand Isaac's significance, became a guardian of his legacy. As the 1850s unfolded and national tensions grew, she became openly involved in abolition networks, helping enslaved people escape. She was arrested in 1858 and jailed for 3 months. After her release, she wrote to an abolitionist friend, "Masters fear rebellion, fire, blood, destruction. But what they should fear more is the day enslaved people stop pretending, the day they stop performing the lie." Isaac never raised a hand. He simply refused to act the part they wrote for him. And that refusal, multiplied across thousands, could bring down everything they built. Josiah Twain underwent his own transformation. He never declared himself an abolitionist publicly. His wealth and status made that impossible. But his letters reveal a man quietly breaking from the system. In 1854, he sold his cotton factoring business and moved into banking, refusing to profit from slavery. It cost him money and standing, yet he held firm. In an 1860 letter to his son, he wrote, "I discovered that our system requires blindness, deliberate blindness. Anyone who interferes with that blindness becomes unbearable to the rest of us. I can no longer pretend not to see what is plainly visible." Meanwhile, South Carolina lawmakers, terrified by what Isaac had exposed, passed laws in 1848 and 1849 criminalizing the education of enslaved people. Books, writing, literacy became threats far greater than weapons. Isaac had proven that intelligence itself could destabilize the entire system. Throughout the 1850s, more white Southerners began to feel the cracks forming. Some experienced sudden crises of conscience. Others slowly lost faith in the world they'd inherited. The louder the defenses of slavery became, the more obvious the insecurity behind them. Everyone sensed the foundations weakening. By 1861, when the Civil War finally erupted, no one connected the conflict to a single enslaved man with mismatched eyes. Historians trace the war to politics, economics, ideology, but never to one African man who had spent 8 months proving that slavery was a psychological system built on lies, and that those lies shattered when confronted with truth. Maybe that's how history works. Huge events shaped by countless unseen acts, ripples that spread until they're indistinguishable from the waves. No one knows for certain what happened to Isaac after December 20th, 1847. Perhaps he drowned in the Mississippi, another lost victim of a system that couldn't tolerate him. Or perhaps he escaped through the Underground Railroad network near the Arkansas Landing and made it north. A tantalizing clue surfaced in 1852 when Frederick Douglass wrote about Meeting, a remarkable man from the South, educated in Africa, whose insights into the psychology of slaveholders surpassed anything I have heard. He provided no name. It might have been Isaac or someone like him. The evidence is thin, but the possibility lingers. What isn't in doubt is the impact Isaac left behind: 28 documented owners in 8 months, 5 men who abandoned the slave trade entirely, others who suffered breakdowns, crises of conscience, or total transformations, dozens more whose lives bent in ways they couldn't explain, and beyond those records, countless enslaved people who learned from him, who saw in him a reminder that the mind could stay free even when the body was chained. Isaac didn't start a rebellion, he didn't lead an uprising, he didn't write pamphlets or give speeches. He simply existed as a fully conscious, fully intelligent human being inside a system that required him to be less than human. And that alone cracked the world for everyone who encountered him. This story reminds us that the most powerful form of resistance isn't always violent. Sometimes it's the refusal to pretend, the refusal to let oppression rewrite your mind, the refusal to play the part demanded of you. What do you think? Did Isaac possess some unique gift, or was his power simply the truth everyone else tried to avoid? Can one person change the world just by refusing to hide who they are? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you and you want more hidden histories and buried mysteries from America's past, make sure you subscribe to Vintage Chains. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And share this video with someone who loves stories that challenge what we think we know. See you in the next chapter of the past, one that refuses to stay forgotten.